Okay. Good evening, and I'm going to wish myself welcome home. It's nice to get back after those weeks in Chutz La'aretz. It was Baruch Hashem a wonderful trip, but it's as Margaret just said, there's no place like home, and it's Baruch Hashem wonderful to be back in Eretz Yisrael and back in Yerushalayim. And to tell you the truth, this week's Devar Torah, this week's learning, really is going to be emphasizing how important, to a certain extent, Eretz Yisrael is. This week's parsha is fascinating in that it's really biblical poli-sci. It's political science as seen through Torah, and rules about setting up a king and an army and a rabbanut and setting up the Kohanim and setting up a government in general. And then after that, there are all sorts of rules about jurisprudence, about law. And one of the most important laws, I'm not sure it's the most important, but it's one of the laws that has the largest space in the Parsha, is about if, God forbid, someone kills someone by mistake, an inadvertent case of manslaughter. And then they go to an Eir Miklat. And right after that section about the Eir Miklat, the refuge city where they will live until the Kohen Gadol dies, right after that comes this halacha that we're going to really talk about tonight, which is lo tasig gevul reyecha. You shall not move back the boundary of your neighbor. So the translation in front of us, which comes from JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, you shall not move your neighbor's landmarks. In the days before the Intifada, when I lived in Efrat, and we used to often walk in Arab areas, we would see in the Arab fields piles of rocks. Sometimes there'd be 4 or 5, but most of the time it was 3 rocks: a large rock, a smaller rock, and a smallest rock, just piled up on the side of on the side of the shvil, on the side of the path you were following. And these were markers that delineated the property of the Arab farmers and shepherds that lived in that area. And they knew that this is where their property ended and the next guy's property began. And what we're talking about here is that in Eretz Yisrael in biblical times, there were similar types of piles of rocks that delineated the end of my property. And so these markers that we're calling the gvul, the boundary markers, were set up by previous generations. The English here says previous, but in the Hebrew it says rishonim, the first ones. In other words, the boundaries that we are identifying on the edge of our property were the boundaries that were set up when the Jews, hi, good to see you, were the boundaries that were set up when the Jews first came into the land. We think about the big job when the Jews came into Eretz Yisrael was dividing the country up between the 12 tribes. And that's true. That was an important job, but there was also dividing up the individual family plots, separating them from each other. So we believe that these markers, these little piles of rocks that were all over the countryside, were showing the families for generations to come exactly where the family boundaries ended from the time of Yehoshua when the land was first conquered. So it's not just previous generations, it's the first generations coming into Eretz Yisrael. In the property that will be allotted to you, in the land that your God is giving you. so that the portions of the land were a combination of the people working hard to delineate where the tribes and the families were, but also there was the pulling of the lots from the ostracons, the little pieces of pottery from these pots, which meant that it was a lottery that was decided and gave the will of Hashem, of God, over who should get which portion. So these land designations, these border rocks, we believe both were done by the people in that first generation and even had the blessing, if not the direction, of Hashem. So this is a big deal to make sure that everybody kept the land that was allotted to them. Okay, so Rashi, commenting on this verse, says, you shall not remove thy fellows, your neighbor's landmark. Tasig, the word that means to move away, is of the same meaning as they are turned back. So in other words, don't take the boundary markers and move them back, because what would that do? The meaning is that one moves the marker that shows the division of the lands backwards into the field of the neighbor in order therefore to enlarge his own. The purpose of moving these boundary markers was to steal property from your neighbor. I want more land for my sheep, or I want to make sure that that water that comes down through the valley is in my land and not in his. That's why they moved them. So it's literally stealing the livelihood and the land of your neighbor. But doesn't already state back in Vayikra, you shall not rob, you shouldn't steal. Why then is Lord's commanded you can't move the boundaries, the markers, the landmarks? Isn't it stealing? We've already been told it's asur, it's prohibited to steal. Aha. It teaches that one who obliterates his neighbor's borderline transgresses two negative commands, two averot. It's two sins. Why? Because one is regular stealing and one is moving these boundaries. But one might think this is the case also if you do that outside the land of Israel. Okay? Rivka and I were just in New Jersey. So if I take my fence and move it onto the lawn of my neighbor in Teaneck, New Jersey, I'm stealing. I've done a sin. However, it's not this sin. It's just the sin of stealing. Why? Scripture, however, the Torah is teaching us, in thine inheritance which you shall inherit in the land. Thus, in the land of Israel, one who does this transgresses two negative commands, two averot, two sins. While outside the land of Israel, you've only transgressed one. In other words, stealing land in Israel is much worse than stealing land anyplace else. Now, why is that true? Now, we could say this right away because the land is more valuable. The land is more meaningful. The significance to us and our history and our destiny is so much greater. But there's more to it. And we're going to see a number of commentaries who are going to describe how this idea is very Zionistic, of course, the Kedusha, the value of land in Eretz Israel, but also there are some very important theological, philosophic ideas that are contained in this. So let's start to go through some of the ideas that flow from this idea. Number one, Zionism. Beyond that, we'll see a few more. Rabbeinu Bechaye, now I just put this in the way he had it. I would have, if I were writing his comment, I would have had the stuff at the bottom before the stuff at the beginning, but I'm going to do it in the order that he presented it. So he's going to actually give two different sort of separate ideas about the importance of this mitzvah. It is also possible to understand the whole verse in terms of whether the universe, as we know it, preceded God. He's saying right away, we're talking philosophy here. When we say don't move the boundaries that were set up under the auspices of God, it doesn't just mean my land. It means the entire universe, the cosmos, if you will. Such a person turns the clock backward, philosophically speaking, seeing that he makes God the totally free and unlimited, subject to the limitations of time and space. If you move back the limits of time and space, you're saying, well, look, here's God, okay? And here's the edge of the universe. What we believe is that God created the universe and he's outside. If you move the boundary, all of a sudden you're saying God's in the universe and there's something beyond it. God is not the controller of the universe. Instead, God is just another thing, a great thing, but part of the universe. So don't move the boundary of the edge of the universe to include God, because God is outside of it as the creator. God was here before. If you put the boundaries outside, you're saying, oh, the universe is greater than God. So it's a philosophic problem, according to Rabbeinu Bechaye here at the beginning. The Rishonim, the early scholars in the years between 1000 and about 1554, the Rishonim mention in our verse none other than Avicha v'zekinecha. The earlier people in our verse are talking about your father and the elders. Mentioned later in the poem Ha'azinu, recited by Moshe Rabbeinu, who have taught you in response to your inquiry that God preceded all phenomena, which we call the universe, that God is the first. And our earlier scholars and parents and grandparents, they knew that. There is no need for that verse to testify to the truth of Moshe and his prophecies, seeing the people had been eyewitnesses to that. In other words, we're not trying to prove to you that Moshe is the prophet. We're trying to prove to you a bigger idea, that God is the thing that precedes the universe. He's Rishon and he's Achron. He's first and he's last. Why would they have to ask their fathers and elders? Shouldn't we be able to figure this out philosophically? Why do we have to ask others? The reason the verse adds here, B'nachalatcha asher tinchal, in your portion, which was given to you, is to stress that the whole focus of our existence on earth is Eretz Yisrael. That this is where Jews belong. This is where Jews alone and can fulfill their destiny, which is the Emtsaut HaOlam, which is the middle of the universe. It's from here in Eretz Yisrael. They would even say here in Yerushalayim, Harabayit, that way, about a kilometer and a half. That's the middle, the navel of the universe. That's where everything else emanates from there. It's here that we recognize that God was the first and created everything. The reason why this verse was written immediately following the discussion about murder and manslaughter and killing people is to remind us that just as such border violations will eventually lead to murder. So this is the comment of Rabbeinu Bechaye. I wish he had put verse before he gave the philosophic idea. He's saying, oh, we put this here connected to murder because one of the prime reasons for murder in the ancient world and probably in the modern world is over possessions. That if I move the border and I steal part of my friend's field, what might happen? He's going to come over and fight with me, and one of us may end up killing the other. That's apparently, according to many commentaries, what the fight was between Cain and Abel. The first murder may have been over the borders of their separate portions. at least according to the Midrash. To remind us that just as such border violations eventually lead to murder, that is a situation described in verse 11, v'hikaho nefesh, and you'll smite somebody a mortal blow. He will kill a soul deliberately, will have no place to escape to. So heretical views about the universe, having preceded the Creator, will also result in the soul of a person believing this, not having anywhere to escape to. In other words, since moving borders can lead to the kind of fights that causes someone to kill another, changing the borders of the universe to say that God didn't create it but is part of the universe, that's another kind of violence that we have to stay away from. And then he says one last sentence. The six extremities of both the physical and the celestial world will not find room to accommodate the soul of such heretics. Now, there's no place for people that don't believe that God created heaven and earth. There is no place for such people in this world. What does he mean by the six extremities? What he means is front, right, back, left, up, and down. Each one of us describes a sort of a box. I'm boxed in by four sides, above and below, and I am the point in the middle of this six-sided box. That's the six extremities or boundaries around each person. And that point in the middle, that's number 7. And Rabbeinu Bechaye and many other mystical rabbis believe this is the source of why number 7 is so holy in Judaism, because it describes me noticing my place in the universe, surrounded by front, right, back, left, up, and down, and I'm in the middle. And I feel those boundaries. I sense these six extremities around me. And my holiness, my 7ness, which represents holy in most Jewish thinking, is because I recognize these boundaries. Recognizing boundaries adds, in mysticism, to our kedusha, to our sanctity. Rav Hirsch actually wrote a much longer comment on this. I just took a little piece of it. And he said, excuse me, adding the idea about these boundaries that they were set up by our ancestors, by the first Jews coming into Eretz Israel, brings an added question. It reminds us that the apportionment of the land wasn't only for the tribes, but was for each individual as well. So the stealing of a neighbor's property is also a sin against those who apportioned the land. I'm sinning against Moshe, who started the process. I'm sinning against Yehoshua, who carried on the process. And I'm sinning against God, who sanctioned and influenced the entire process. All landowners in Israel should feel that they are continuing the work of those who initially conquered and apportioned it. When I farm my little piece of land in Israel, I should see myself as a continuation of what happened in the days of Yehoshua. That my planting a seed is similar to Yehoshua conquering the land. That we controlling it and we growing it. And I've mentioned this in many classes previously, one of the most inspiring things about the history of Eretz Israel is whenever the Jews live in Eretz Israel, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. Whenever other nationalities, non-Jews, control the land, it is a desolate wasteland. That was true in the 1800s, in the beginning of the 1900s. And once we became a Medina, we became, again, a country that exported, oranges and fruit and all sorts of wonderful things. The land only blooms and blossoms when it is controlled by the Jews. This is the continuation of the promise that Eretz Israel only belongs to us. Our verse is protecting the two areas of ownership recognized by the Torah. What are the two kinds of ownership? One is ba'alut, actually owning something. It's my possession that I can go into court and prove it's mine. The other thing is life itself. My life is mine. There are two kinds of ownership that we recognize. The primary ownership is my life, but there's a secondary ownership that means things, stuff. And this pasuk is talking about both. It's talking about my life as connected to the land and to God, but it's also talking about the stuff that I grow and the stuff that I have in this property. This is powerful ideas that the Rav Hirsch says is hinted at in this verse, and he believes that the two primary principles of Torah laws have to do with ownership and protection of life. We protect property and we protect life. That's what Torah is about. It's interesting that he wrote this in the middle of the 1800s, the same time when communism was beginning. And to a certain extent, Rabbi Hirsch may have been responding to Marx, whom he, whose works he was acquainted with, even if I don't know if he knew the man himself. But he's trying to say that ownership is part of Torah. And this idea that, everything can be shared cooperatively is not a Torah idea. We should be kind and generous to others, but ownership, just like life itself, is a basic idea in Judaism. Okay, one of my favorite modern rabbis who's been sneaking into a number of our classes and my articles is Rav Amnon Bazak, who's a Rebbe at Yeshivat Har Etzion. I served with him in the IDF, and I really like him very much. And he's also a terrific scholar. I was an old man in the army. He was a young man, so he's still on his way up. And he says, clearly, this is a very severe prohibition. This issue that it's talking about, he's not saying what the issue is yet, but clearly we're talking about something very, very serious. Why is this idea so very serious? Because it is repeated in the later curses. When the Jews come into Eretz Israel, they were supposed to immediately go to Shechem. Half the nation's going to stand on Har Eval, which looks desolate. The other's going to stand on Har Grizim, which looks beautiful and very, very verdant and fertile. And they're going to be told blessings and curses, like the two mountains. One looks like it's cursed and one looks like it's blessed. So we're supposed to stand there. And 11 curses were pronounced. And the number 3 in this list of 11 is, cursed is the one who moves the border stone of their, it says fellow, I would have translated it, neighbor. Cursed is such a person. Oh my God. This must be a very severe avera, because it's one of the things for which Yoshua and the Kohen Gadol together announced to the people as we curse such people. Why? So what issue stands behind this prohibition? If it's so important that we're saying these people should be eliminated, cursed, and why is it mentioned here? Apparently, there is a double implication in our prohibition. First, by mentioning the original apportionment of the land under Yoshua, we're being informed that this also is a communal issue. We're not just talking about my land and my neighbor's land. We're talking about an issue that affects the entire community. If I break down the way the land was apportioned in the days of Yoshua, it's chaos. Then none of the rules are in place. So point number 1 is it has to do with communal stability ramifications. I love that phrase. There are tremendous problems, not just for my relationship with my neighbor, but my relationship, everyone's relationship with society. It's the only way society can function, if people can protect what is theirs. However, there's another implication. The Torah points out in a unique way that this crime is also against the divine nature of the apportionment and possession of the land. If I move the border between me and my neighbor, I'm not just stealing from him, I'm declaring I annul our conquest of the land. Part of the conquest of the land was saying, this is my land, this is your land. That's what the Kohanim did. That's what Joshua did. They apportioned the land. When I deny that, I deny our entire conquest. I'm perhaps denying our entire right to the land. If I don't believe that the behavior, that the actions, that the ramifications of what was done by those people is holy and permanent, maybe I'm saying I don't believe that God gave us the land at all. Anyone who's stronger, let them just come and take it. So it really is a chaotic breakdown of society, according to Rabbi Bazak. The divine reality is shared with the preceding mitzvah of the refuge cities, that these are holy places where people can go if they have committed manslaughter, and they stay there until the Kohen Gadol has died, and that is their atonement, which are also a testament to the special holy character of the land, that people who have shed blood, they can't just walk around the land. They have to stay in certain locations until they've done tshuva. Then they're free. The special nature of the Isur, of this prohibition, comes up again in the story of Achav. Now, Achav, who in English is called Ahab, for those of you who like Moby Dick, okay, King Ahab, or King Achav, saw the land, really it was a vineyard that was right outside his palace in the Shomron, that belonged to a person named Navot. And you can see this is chapter 21 of Malachim Aleph. And what happened was, he said to Navot, I'd like to buy your land. And Navot said, no, I'm not interested. I love my land. It's a wonderful vineyard. I get tremendous satisfaction and livelihood out of this. I don't want to sell it to you. I'm sorry, Mr. King. But what happens is, Ahab then goes and tells his wife, Izebel, which comes into English as Jezebel, Izebel. He says to her, oh, this is terrible. I wanted that vineyard and he won't give it to me. And her suggestion is, kill him and take the land. And that's, obviously a horrible idea, but he does it. On a legal level, stealing land in the diaspora is a sin. But moving a boundary marker in Eretz Yisrael, stealing land in Eretz Yisrael, transgresses twice: theft and an attack on the apportionment of the land to our ancestors. At this point, I just want to add one little idea to the chulent of ideas we've been talking about. Remember, let's say, I don't like being a farmer. I'm not a very successful farmer. I'd like to sell my farm. So in Eretz Yisrael, I can sell my farm. But when Jubilee, Yovel comes 50 years later, it comes back to me and my family. So even if I want to get out of the land owning business, my family can't, because the land, after 50 years or whatever number of years are left till the Yovel year, it comes back. Selling land in Eretz Yisrael is by its nature just alien to us. The idea is foreign to us because the land belongs to whomever it was given to by Yehoshua during the time of the conquest. And that should have been true forever, but it was only true until the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And after that, we did the best we could. And we hope in Yemot HaMashiach that we'll return to that system of knowing who belongs to which families and which land belongs to us. But in Eretz Yisrael, land doesn't change hands. It stays with the original owners. Okay. Rashi, on one of the two verses in Mishlei that mentions this sin. So when King Solomon, and we're going to have two comments by the Malbim talking about this also, in the book of Proverbs, King Solomon brings up this prohibition twice. And he brings it up twice because he believed that, like all of the book of Proverbs, he believes that it has something basic to add to the way that human beings should behave. Proverbs is advice on how to be a not just a normal person, but a person who has ethics and morality, a good person. And so twice we mention don't move boundary rocks on your land, because it doesn't just have to do with the land, it has to do with who I am. As the entire book of Proverbs talks about, it's how I develop my own sanctity and character. So Rashi says, do not turn away from the custom of your forefathers. When it says don't move the boundaries of your forefathers, of your ancestors, of the first ones who came into Eretz Yisrael, it's not just talking about the land. Rashi's saying what King Shlomo meant when he quoted this idea, he said, don't change the customs of your grandfather. Be like your father and your grandfather. Carry on their customs. Carry on all of their positive traits. Whatever good behavior they modeled for you, you model that for your children and grandchildren. Our sages of blessed memory said, if one places a basket under a vine at the time of vintage, at the time when you are harvesting, so that the fallen grapes should fall into it, concerning this was stated, do not remove an ancient boundary. So remove here, again, is based on the word taseg, move away, shall not draw backwards. In other words, don't draw away from the behavior, from the wonderful grapes, the wonderful wine, the wonderful behavior that this is a metaphor for of your ancestors. Be like them, copy them. So that's one half of the picture. The other half of the picture, for those of us who are a little bit older, for us, model behavior for your children and grandchildren that is worthy of being emulated and is worthy of carrying on. The Malbim, also on that verse in Mishlei, he says, why is this verse here in Proverbs? This prohibition was already mentioned in Devarim. We had this already. Why does King Solomon, why does Shlomo Melech repeat it? However, there it was in the context of one's neighbor. Here, however, Shlomo HaMelech, refers to the removal of any boundary made by our ancestors. These are customs and behaviors of our ancestors. In the words of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rashbi, the author of the Zohar, our great sage of Kabbalah, don't change the customs of your ancestors. Similar to the fact that Avram established Shachrit. When we daven Shachrit, I am following the custom of Avram. When I daven Mincha, I'm following the custom of Yitzchak. When I daven Ma'ariv, I'm following the custom of Yaakov Avinu. In other words, when it says don't move the boundaries, don't change the behavior. Do your best to emulate what was the most wonderful character traits of our revered ancestors. That's what it's talking about. And it means keep the customs. Okay. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov also was talking about this in a non-literal, in a figurative, in a midrashic, in an almost poetic way. Do not move back the ancient boundary stones. Why? This is when a person retreats from his limit and turns back. I know my limitations. I know my limitations. I remember, this is a terrible example, but at least it'll help me make the point. I remember when I used to jog in my 30s and my 40s, and I knew how fast I could go, and I knew how far I could go. I knew, and so I did my best to try to reach those limits. And when there were days when I didn't get a good night's sleep, or I was coming down with a cold, and I couldn't quite do as well as I normally did, I felt bad. I didn't reach my gavul. I didn't reach my boundaries. So Rabbi Nachman says that's a spiritual idea. He's talking about not jogging. He's talking about learning. He's talking about doing mitzvot. He's talking about davening. If I don't keep up to my limits in my spiritual endeavors, I've moved the boundary markers. I haven't moved it away. I've moved it closer. I've closed myself off. It's a spiritual fall. A person falls from his original level and turns back to something less. God forbid. Nevertheless, one can strengthen himself and never give himself over to despair. Rabbi Nachman spent a lot of his time very depressed. So he gives a lot of good advice about depression. Don't despair. Don't give up hope. For even in such a place, God can be found. Look back at the pasuk. Look back at the verse. It says, don't move your neighbor's landmarks, the property that would be allotted to the land that God gave you. In other words, I can get back to the limits. I can get back to my goals in spirituality by doing what? By realizing that God is my help in getting to the true levels that I know I can reach. Okay. For even in such a place, God can be found, corresponding to, and if I made my bed in hell, here you are as well. That God is always willing and helpful for me in my spiritual boundaries, not just in my physical boundaries of my farm or my pasturage. This is an aspect of the name Sag, enough. The Malbim, commenting on the second time that this mitzvah comes up in the book of Mishlei, the text has already said, don't move the boundary stone of your ancestors. Here we are learning about the boundaries of the poor. The next and the final time that it gets mentioned in Mishlei, in Ketuvim, in the later writings of Tanakh, it's talking about make sure that you don't encroach on those gifts that the Torah gives to the poor. The boundaries it's talking about is in my field. If I drop some of my wheat, I have to leave it there for the poor. I can't harvest all the way to the corners of my field. If I forgot a bundle of wheat in the field, I have to leave it for the poor. Don't change those boundaries of what God and the Torah made the property of those less fortunate than us. I have to always be looking out for stepping on other people's toes when it's their area that I am trespassing, encroaching upon. Okay. Sefer Hasidim, again, more mystical approach. Do not move your fellow's border as the first ones bordered, as the earlier ones, the Rishonim, that originally came and set the boundaries. Again, it's specifically in the literal meaning a reference to Yoshua and that generation, that they established the melodies. That here it's talking about a totally different idea. We have traditional tunes. We call it trup. He translated, my translation was melodies. It's trup. We have the way in which we chant the Torah, the way in which we chant the Haftorah, the way in which we chant the different Megillot. The way we read Eicha is different than the way we read Megillat Esther. He's saying, don't change the borders, don't change the customs. That we're supposed to realize that there are certain specific ways that we traditionally have done things. And it's our job to continue those methods and make sure that they get passed on as well to the next generation. And then he said that now what he's going to say now is not historically true, but it's a beautiful idea. So we're just going to think about it as an idea rather than, he says, that not to use the Torah melody for the prophets or the writings. In other words, there's one trop for the Torah. There are different trops when we read a Haftorah, different trops when we read the Megillot. For it is all a law given to Moshe from Sinai, that all of our tunes that we sing were given by God to Moshe at Har Sinai. Not historically true. It's a beautiful idea to believe that most of the tunes that we use now, we believe came from the period of the Gaonim, which is, like over 1,000 years ago. So it's a long time that we've been using these methods of reading this material, which we believe enhances its educational power and its ability to evoke emotions from the community. But it doesn't go back to Moshe Rabbeinu, but we'll accept this for the time being. And why is it said that? Because at Har Sinai, when God was talking to Moshe Rabbeinu and giving over the 10 commandments, it says Moshe answered him in sound, in cold, that Moshe sang it back. So in other words, the voice, the sound, the tunes that we use in the distribution and in the enhancement of our Torah experience, that's a recreation of Moshe Rabbeinu chanting the material that God said on Har Sinai to the Jews, which is a beautiful idea, and it's not historically true, but the idea is, again, we're supposed to maintain boundaries. So boundaries can mean the land, boundaries can mean my spiritual attainments, and boundaries can mean the customs that our communities use. Now, this last comment on the page actually is a wonderful comment, and I don't know the person, Shammai Engelmeyer. I don't know who he is, but I saw on the Yeshivat Har Etzion website this comment, and I think it really fits in with how this law gets applied in the modern world. Although everything we said to now is making it sound like it's connection to the ancient world, but really, according to the Gemara, there is indeed a very important application to this rule that has nothing to do with agriculture, but has a lot to do with business. The sages of blessed memory began the process of evolving Hasagat Gevul into an entire code of business law, although very cautiously. It begins with a Gemara in really a Mishnah, and then the Gemara in Baba Batra that talks about someone who lived in a certain area of a town, and he had a mill. He took grain and he ground it into flour. And another guy from another town comes and opens up a mill in the same area of town. And the Mishnah, then the Gemara explains, that's Hasagat Gevul. I have overstepped the boundaries of that other person. Does that have anything to do with moving boundaries, boundary markers? Does it have anything to do with fields? Does it have anything to do with the apportionment of the land in Eretz Yisrael? Of course not. It has to do with the reapplication by our sages and by modern halachic decisors of this law and how it applies in the modern world. Specifically, they included encroaching on the rights of the poor under this commandment. Now, we talked about that already. because the pasuk in Mishlei mentions the poor, and making sure we don't in any way infringe upon the rights the Torah gave them. And they open the door to Hasagah Gvul, protecting intellectual property. And in the modern world, that's its most important use. That I am not supposed to. I heard somebody, sing a song. I'm going to record it. That's Hasagat Gvul. I stepped over the boundary into his territory. I saw a new way of programming that someone hasn't yet marketed, and I'm going to market it before him. That's stealing. That's Hasagat Gvul. That all of these ideas have been reapplied to a plethora of modern issues, beginning with business practices and now into the whole area of intellectual property, which is becoming a bigger and bigger issue as the most valuable things in the modern world are ideas. There was just a story this week about a young man here in Eretz Yisrael who came up with a new way of programming, and he just sold the idea for $80 million. And if someone in his business had stolen it and given it, sold it before he could have, that would have been Hasagat Gvul. We have to be very careful, because value today is not in land. Value today is in ideas. Thus, in the Sifri, the halachic midrash on the book of Devarim, we are told that merely attributing an opinion or ruling to the wrong person is considered Hasagat Gvul. In other words, if I say that I made up this psak, or I made up this pshat on something, that's Hasagat Gvul if it really came from somebody else. Even attributing it to the wrong person is Hasagat Gvul. I have to be very careful that everybody is very honest and upright. What is mine and what is somebody else's? And attributions, that's part of the whole issues. He is violating a negative commandment from you shall not move your neighbor's landmark. By the medieval period, Hasagat Gvul was fully protective of intellectual property as well as business practices. This is what's happened with this idea. We began with a very simple law about, hey, don't move that boundary marker. That's stealing. And we've brought it all the way up to don't infringe on other people's ideas. Don't steal their ideas. Because, I don't know how better to say it than the title I put at the top of the page. Because as Robert Frost wrote a half a century ago, good fences make good neighbors. It's just true that people have to know what's mine and what's somebody else's. And even if I think in the poem, he talks about his neighbor. And one day they were talking about fixing the fence. Just 1 minute. For those of us, I'm from New England, so it's like this is like something I'm used to. The fences in New England are piles of rocks, which was not that different from here in Eretz Yisrael. What happened was the fields in New England were just inundated with rocks during the last ice age. The glaciers just carried all these rocks, and so you can't farm. So they took all the rocks from the fields and they put them on the borders, and these rocks become the fences. But all the time, these fences fall down. So every year they have to pile them up again. By the way, the same thing is true in Yehuda, in the whole area south of us, in the area around Efrat. Every spring, the Arabs that had the vineyards around the different valleys, had to put the rocks back because in the rain in the wintertime eroded them. They have to put them back. So in New England, they had to do the same thing. You have to put the rocks back. And so he had a neighbor, and his neighbor had pine trees, and he had an apple orchard. And he said, why do I have to put up a boundary? My pine trees have nothing to do with your apples. What's going on? Well, let's not. And the neighbor said, you're making a mistake. Good fences make good neighbors. everybody should know their boundaries. That's true of fields. That's true of ideas. That's true of all of my relationships. Know the boundaries. Don't overstep. There are so many times when, as a teacher, and of course, when I taught middle school, teenagers, people were encroaching on other people's prerogatives and other people's space all the time, and it drove people crazy. One person was getting tremendous benefit, and the other one was suffering tremendously. Good fences make good neighbors. It's true about Eretz Yisrael, it's true about business, and it's true in our private lives. Everybody has a right to boundaries, and everybody has to be very careful about everybody else's boundaries. And hopefully, when we care enough about other people's boundaries, they'll care about ours as well. It begins with our worrying about other people's boundaries. This idea started with a philosophic importance of Eretz Yisrael, but it also has to do very much with all of our personal relationships. Please always understand that when we're talking about Hasagat Gvul, yes, there are tremendously important philosophic and technical points about what it means for farmers and what it means for computer analysts and what it means for writers, but also know what it means for the next door neighbor in your apartment building, or the person across the path in your private home. We all have to make sure that we guard our boundaries, both to the extent that we fill up our space with wonderful things, but also make sure that we don't overstep those boundaries and interfere with other people as well. And there are just 4 times Tanakh brings up this idea, and I think there are just many, many areas in which this idea is tantamount to having a successful spiritual experience in life. And Hasagat Gavul is something that we should avoid for others. And as Rabbi Nachman says, use it to reach your full potential as well. Okay, so we're back. We're back on target. Thank you for joining tonight. I hope I hope get back into the schwung, get back into the habit of our Monday nights, and everyone should have a wonderful Chodesh Elul as we get ready spiritually for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And it's good to see everybody, and it's wonderful to be back home here in Eretz Yisrael. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome. Erev Tov. Bye-bye.
Erev Tov.